Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. We're going to have another exciting episode here. I am Charles Love with my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And we have two, not one but two, count them, special guests this week. Winegard, he is a PhD in social psychology. And Tade, I never got around to asking you how to pronounce your last name, and I don't want to mangle it.
Yeah.
Souaiaia?
Yeah.
I didn't do too bad, huh? And he is a professor at SUNY Downstate. And I know sometimes we kind of cover a lot of things, but initially we're going to talk about cultural hereditarianism. And, or as I was joking before we started recording, to sum it up for us normals, why Asians better than us? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, obviously, there's Will has some really long threads on Twitter, and we have some debates in our cultural fight and discussions that we have that sometimes get narrowed down to, are some of these things genetic? So are blacks just born able to dunk a ball better? Are Asians just smarter than the rest of us, right? Are white boys, I don't know, what are you all better at? I don't know. But you know,
looking at their nose and stops black.
Right. So, you know, let's talk about that. So, because it's important, we need to know what the stats say, you know, separate fact from fiction. And if we're going to solve the problem, we need to know if it's just, you know, a parenting issue. Is it, you know, nature versus nurture, you know, what the situation is. So Will has this long thread. So do I want to start with Will to start some? Yeah, Will,
I can definitely jump in for a second.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually want to hear what the guests have to say. But yeah, this is something that myself, Bo, a number, Rod Grant, he didn't, as I recall, want to do this appearance, a number online debate back and forth. But why are there different groups of people in terms of average performance? And there are three basic positions. Hereditarianism, which is the argument that some chunk of that, and I have a question for, because it seems to be totally undefined in the literature, but some chunk. There's culturalism, which is the argument like, okay, maybe a little on the racism end, but most of this is culture, training, IQ around the world, increased 18 points the past 100 years. And then there's sort of the CRT paradigm, and it's them to argue in my experience, but that's the argument, racism, prejudice. They would say something like systems of power being totally what causes these gaps. For example, under whites and Latinos at a personal level, often under ascending levels of power or higher rank in society. So those are the big three. And Dr. Souaiaia, if I have that correct, as I strong genetics background, but is not a hereditarian in the traditional sense. Dr. Winegard is, to some extent, again, we're going to discuss what that means. But both of them are going to kind of field answers to these questions from the panel. We are also going to be joined by Tyrone Williams, who writes as Immune Hack, who thinks it's something else almost, diet and epigenetics that determines how people do. That if you gave Americans a healthier diet, we would lose on average, I think he says 60 pounds. IQ would probably boost. It's an interesting idea. Unfortunately, he was coming to us from the UK and now is not. It's 3 a.m. or something like that where he is.
Yeah.
But so these are the guests today. And whoever wants to fire the first question, I mean, I've got a list of them, but.
Well, I want to say something first before we get to the technical pieces and talking about what studies show and everybody's individual view. Let's talk about just the norm. You say a lot of this stuff gets kicked around on social media and everybody has these views. We've been hearing some of these, let's say at least stereotypes about groups for years. They're based on something. But what would you all, each of you, say that you would think the average person believes? So what do you, not your beliefs, but what do you think the norm in American society is? What do you think the average person, and you can say in general, you can say, well, the average white thinks this or black thinks this if you think it's different. But what do you think the norms are? Shamika?
I think the norms are probably that people are different based on race. I mean, I think that's what most people just kind of leave it there.
I know they
You
say
mean
it a
like
lot, but
People are better athletes or whatever.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's what people believe. So I'm interested in hearing the conversation.
okay, Bo, what do you think?
That's a tough one. So I think probably a lot of people do just think, look, groups are different. Contemplate it much further. They don't ask. They just think, yeah, groups are different, whatever. Ask slightly more educated people, worried about saying that. And so I paper once, and it was asking people about IQ gaps. And people consistently underestimated the real gap. Now, Wilfred and I will have a little bit of a disagreement about the size of the actual gap, but not much of one. We all agree there is this gap. It's somewhere between 10 and 15 points, right? So if you look at what people say, they did this survey, and like I think conservatives were more accurate, and they put it at like 5 to something. So in fact, they were wrong in too much. So those are.
Tade?
Wow. So I'm gonna try to be brief here. So with my background, right? So I kind of chose the two worst things to combine, right? I chose track and field and basketball, right? So those don't go together. And I've been a professor now for I guess 4 years, but for a long time I trained athletes, right? I trained white kids, black kids, and you know I ran for a long time. And the stereotypes are definitely stronger. I guess part of the reason why they can be stronger is because they determine as much about you. You know, I would run races, and if I would win, people would be like, "Where are you from? Where are you?" And then they'd be like, "Oh, that makes sense." And I trained, you know, white kids and
That's what I was thinking, Bo. What
great
are
basketball
you?
players, and you know, they would say things like,
Yeah, are you terrestrial?
like, my son will never be able to jump like you because he's white. And it was really tough. And so for me, I don't believe that at all. Like, and it's harder to, I think, get over that one. I think people can sort of look at the data as far as, you know, IQ tests, or I have my issues with those, but let's just say like the standardized tests, right? They can look at that and say, okay, that's cultural, but they look at, you know, track and field, and they say that has to be physical, right? Because it looks so physical, right? So that has to be a biological difference. But I mean, I'm in Los Angeles now, and if you go to USC, you know, in South Central, Monday through Thursday on the track, you'll see, you know, somewhere around 200 black kids sprinting and being yelled at and training, and you don't sort of see the cultural difference in sports, whereas you sort of see it in school, right? So
So I know you're going to get into some of this stuff, but I'm just trying to narrow you down to remember, we were just talking about.
Yeah, so my point is that
assumptions
I
about
would say
it, right.
people really believe in it when it comes to anything physical. Like, people have strong beliefs. And I think people think it when it comes to things that are intellectual, but they don't want to talk about it, right? Because that's not PC. But to me, they are kind of one and the same, right? Like, don't pretend that we're faster than white people, but we're going to ignore the fact that they do better on tests, right? We have to resolve those things. So to me, like, if you can't be proud that black people jump higher, think that's innate, and then ignore this data about tests, right? To me, it's not innate, but I think we're kind of stuck. And I think people largely believe that physical differences are innate, which I think is mostly wrong, right?
And Will,
Oh, you're asking what I think most people
what
believe?
I think most people think, yeah.
I think it really depends on social class to some extent and training. I think most working class by default would just kind of say what pretty much everyone, you know, people are different. You know, and you hear kind of excuse the language, about this sometimes. Like, one of my buddies is an urban Italian American guy. We were listening to some ranchero music once, and he was like, yeah, Mexicans are really good at singing sad songs. Like, the implication is at least cultural and maybe deeper. So the average working, I think, without even thinking about it, would look at what different groups are doing well at a given time and would assume that that is metacultural to genetic, would be a good way to put it. It's deep. It's what they do. The guys with the guitar, Hispanic. I think with upper class people, there's a bit of an issue because only, which is why I want to have this conversation with the genetics guy and with the co-host. There's only one perspective that's acceptable in kind of woker universities, which is the CRT perspective of it's all due to some kind of racism. So I think a lot of people will try really hard to cling to that. Like if I say, just adjusting for test scores, age, and read and income, which it does. It's a fairly well-known paper that I wrote part of. I'm not journal level at this point. But anyway, I mean, the genetics guy might say something like, well, 20% of that could be genes. But the CRT guy will just sort of ignore that, or will say, well, we don't know about the racism inherent in the system that could have produced that. So anyway, getting to the point, I think working class people don't think much about it, probably genetic if they do. I think highly educated people at least try to pretend very intensely that they think this is all due to power structures. And I think the cultural piece kind of gets lost in this as versus either what are sometimes called HBD and CRT. Like when we look at areas where there are probably genetic human differences, I mean, there might be some disagreement, but I'd say distance running is probably one of these. There are gaps between human groups, but they're tiny. Like the marathon record for Africa is, someone might correct me, but like 2 hours, 2 minutes. For Europe, it's like 2 hours, 5 minutes. And for Asia, it's like 2 hours. So the obvious factor that predicts how well you're going to run is how much time you spend training to run. That's literally probably 95.95% the predictor of your running performance. But I think that that's easy to forget. Poor people tend to say, well, some groups run faster. Rich people tend to, I don't even know what they do in that situation, but in the intellectual environment say, well, it's all due to past racial abuse, something like that. That's the big breakdown.
Wow. Some interesting responses. I think I'm going to learn a bit from all this and maybe move a little bit. I'm kind of, I think I take a little bit of what Will and what Tade said, but I'm still a little different. I don't actually, and I understand why you say it that way, but I don't think they actually think it because their actions say they don't think it, right? Because of what Will said. So they say that there's differences, but then they say, especially the CRT wing you talk about, well, they'll say, take a piece from both of you. So Will's point about the race thing is crucial. So there's differences, but, the outcomes are different because of race. So basically you're saying, but for the system having its thumb on the black man, things would be equal, right? But then they don't, I say they don't explain the opposite, Will. They don't explain why the blacks who do excel. So then explain to me why they do so well in certain areas. So the racist white man, the system is so strong it can hold all black people down except for the ones who are good at these three things. It's a little weird. They just ignore that part. But to Tade's point, you made a point about there being selective belief in genetics. So like a good one with the black people. So they'll say, yeah, of course that fat black woman, oh God, Shamika, I'm sorry. I mean, they'll say that certain types of women, of course she can sing. They can build out a better tone because they, or black women are good at this, or basketball blacks are good. Yeah. We, you know how we do on the court, right? We collectively, we're all good. Like all of us are great basketball players. But then in the same vein, if you say blacks are scoring differently and lower on certain scores, they'll say, well, that's not genetic. That's because the teacher didn't know how to teach them. Or in the CRT wing, they'll say, well, that's why we need education. We need cultural pedagogy. We need math to be taught, black math to be taught to the black kids in a way that the black kids will learn it, right? So that's the way they'll explain that away. Or they'll just say, no, that's not true. It's got to be some other factor why we're not doing so well. But if we're doing well, it's genetic. So that's what I'm saying. I don't really think they even believe it, right? They're using the argument that will make their group seem better or to make their point. That's kind of
so. Do you think that Ta-Nehisi Coates deluded or like self-deluded to work like twice as hard to be successful. Like he said, Obama has to work or had to work twice as hard, and it's like, yeah, but if
I
you,
love that. Go
it's
ahead. I'm
such a
sorry.
weird thing though, because it's like if you compare him to say Bill Clinton, they're probably about equally smart, equally charismatic. I see no evidence that Bill Clinton didn't work really. I mean, like,
Right, but
I
here's the
don't.
key point you got to take. So I like to play because words matter to me. So when they say so, because we all, I know me, I'm, growing up in the 70s and
It's
80s, that's what black parents.
it's
I'm sorry.
it's 10 times as hard. The saying is 10 times, not twice.
Ten
And
times?
everyone
Okay,
heard
my
that, right?
bad.
So you have to
Okay,
work 10 times as hard. Like
I
it's
had
not
it
twice. So
See,
times,
you're
but
going to
it's
have
10
to
times.
stop stealing my thunder because that's what I was going to say. Words matter. So they don't just say they have to work hard. I mean, we always say it was like, things you said in the black neighborhood to push your kids. So my mom and dad was like, there's some racists out there. Doesn't mean you can't succeed, but you got to work twice as hard. But that's different. That's mama in the kitchen. But for this guy who is writing, 20,000 word essays for the Atlantic to say that, I say, you say for Barack Obama to achieve what Clinton achieved, he had to work twice as hard. So not harder, not 1.3% times harder, but it's got to be twice as
twice.
hard, not 2.5. You have the actual racial measure, a slide scale table that tells you how much harder. And how do you know that's how much harder he worked? And then it just becomes this thing in the ethos. I'll give you another example to that. Not just Ta-Nehisi Coates. I was watching an interview between Anderson Cooper and the guy in Atlanta who dresses up like a woman all the time. Shamika, help me out.
Tyler Perry.
My dear, Tyler Perry.
I was like, wait,
So Tyler Perry was talking
Young
about
Thug. I mean, it's a.
right, Atlanta.
right. So
I was
Anderson,
making that joke.
Oh man.
Anderson Cooper was talking to him about the defund the police thing, and Tyler Perry said some really smart things. But one of the things he said was, "Yeah, I support the police, and this thing has gone too far, but." We do have to understand there are some problems, right? So he's going on, and I'm listening to him. But the funny thing to what you said, Bo, he said, well, like, look at it this way, because, he's doing so well. He tells this wonderful story about coming up, how my business is on a lot that used to be a plantation. And to see that this black man now bought this plantation, I own all these acres, I got all this stuff here. And yet, imagine how successful I would be if I wasn't black. So
right.
even in that conversation, he said, "You think I'm successful now, man? If I was white, you could tell me that I'd be Elon Musk if I was white."
Right.
It's silly.
Right.
It's silly, But they say that, but I don't even think they believe it. So yes, he's delusional.
Okay.
Here is my controversial thesis, and I'm going to drop it at the beginning of this, and then we can discuss it later, perhaps. But my thesis: if you are a pretty intelligent black, life is actually better in most ways than a pretty intelligent white person. You have many advantages that an intelligent white can't have. Do you think that that's a fair statement, or am I out of bounds on that?
I'll let
one?
the others answer, but I just want to run a disclaimer that Bo said that. I did not say that. No, I'm kidding. Shamika, what do you think?
I'm running it by as a hypothesis, by the way, and I would support this with some evidence, and we can discuss.
Okay. Shamika?
Well, I would like to know how or why he feels that way. But first, I do want to say that I do think fat women have more space for their diaphragm to expand, and so they do sing better.
I have myself to blame for that. Fat women, that's on me. I got to own that. I should have brought it up. I'm so sorry.
But I would like to know why he feels that way, because I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I feel that way. And I think for me, I automatically say, is it because, is it like versus something? Because you maybe stand out a little bit more? Like, well, what's the reason that an intelligent black person?
Well,
So do you want the others to answer first, Bo, or do you want to answer that? Because you said you back it up first, so do you want the others to say whether they agree with you or not, or do you want to
I
just...
can give it a thing.
sure.
Let's let them say
Sure.
something. Go ahead, Will.
Okay. I mean, I think my honest opinion on that, and I think I kind of jumped in on the end of Shamika, so I want to hear Shamika's point too, but I think that totally depends on class. So a lot of this stuff is actually
Fair.
really fascinating to unpack in terms of the rare amount of real social science that exists So I just wrote a piece on audit studies, and there are these studies that find that if you apply for a job as a black person, you are generally less likely. It's about 7% less likely. It's not what's sometimes presented as being the case, but you face a substantial amount of racism if you go in and apply for just regular ass jobs. But there are two caveats here. One, the black names in these studies are always wild. It's like the black name will be
Right.
Jamarian, and the white name, or like Mansa, and the white name will be Charles, or Galvin was in the most recent study I looked at. So what you're finding, one, is that Jamarian has a harder time than Chuck. I'm not surprised by that. These also, too, focus on the kind of jobs you can easily apply for online. Craigslist is commonly used. What's Mechanical Turk, the social science sourcing platform, although in a slightly different context, is used. So, I mean, you're not looking at any Fortune 1000 positions, academic positions. Most affirmative action, diversity forward positions aren't on there, government positions. But I do think that you're finding that as a working class black guy applying only for in-community jobs, you face some racism. The advantage, I think, comes if you're a smart black person in what one of my professors called the great world. Because there are fewer of us, and we do want to swing back to this theme later, but we're really performing a bit worse, so you're more in demand. Like, I were applying to when I applied to law school, I mean, I knew that there were a certain number of applicants coming out of Chicago, and it was a really dense pool, without stereotyping large Jewish American, Italian American into the law in Illinois. But I knew that only, a tenth of those applicants would be black, and the scores would be on the LSAT 8 or 9 points lower. So I knocked out. I knew that I was competing against this smaller population, perhaps not the same standard. So I had an advantage. Would I have the same advantage if I was like trying to date the local judge's daughter and I was living in Spartanburg, South Carolina? Like, no.
Sure.
So it totally depends on situation. And that's one of my points with a lot of this. It's multivariate. It's complex. It's not racism that explains much of anything most of the time.
Yeah, so I'm going to make that a little. So to try to be as cherry rope the bow as possible, right? So I was talking to a friend about this a while back, and when is it better to be black, right? Let's just say, when's it better? And so in grad school, I had some friends that were white and Chinese, and one of my white friends got his bike stolen on the train on the way home. Another friend got mugged, and then I was walking with a friend on the west side of campus, which isn't the worst neighborhood, but and I would see the kids that were 15, 16, and I would say hi to them, and they were just like, "Oh, you're so lucky! Like these kids wouldn't attack you, right?" And so I see that. Yeah, I would rather walking around in the hood, and if I was a senator, maybe I'd rather be black. Right, so there's two times where it's like advantageous: the very bottom and the very top. But it's not advantageous to get from the bottom to the top. And so that's kind of how I see it, right? Like being a nerdy Chinese kid in grad school, walking into your car, you're terrified because like those guys are targets. They are, and it's better to be a black kid and walk to your car. It is. And if you're a senator and you're trying to get the nomination, right? I mean, Joe Biden said it, right? He's going to pick a woman of color, right? So at the very top and the very bottom, there's advantages to being black or being Hispanic and not being white. But I think what Bo said is better to be smart. It's better to be black if you're smart. There's a lot of smart people who stay trying to get from the bottom to the top and aren't there. So they're not getting this advantage, right? But the ones who, make it to being a senator, for sure. I mean, I'll give you that, but that's sort of a really elite class of people. And then, at the bottom, so I'd say the bottom and the top. Those are the two times that, being white is worse, right? And it's basically because at the bottom, there's hardly, and at the top, there's all white people, right? So you can see why it's advantageous. Like, you stick out if you're white and you're walking around the hood, or if you're Chinese and you walk around, and then at the top you stick out, but at the top they appreciate people who stick out, right? So it's sort of those two opposites, and it's the whole middle where there's a problem, if you ask me.
Okay, Bo, tell us why.
So I would agree. It's sad, maybe a little bit with what Tade. Also, let me just preface this. thank you to everybody for conversation. And this is something that I really on Twitter, not so much some other people, which is that when we have these debates, he doesn't call me names. He uses evidence and we forward data and then we're like, cool, right? So that's what's awesome. I love that. So the audit studies are complicated. I think Wilfred would agree with this. So he's talking about the names seem to have class markers. Another thing, and this is something Charles Murray said on Twitter and got shit for. His point was, well, it's somewhat to discriminate because there is this pipeline of action running through universities such that if you control for the CV or the resume, you're still talking about an IQ disparity applicant and the black applicant. So his argument somewhat rational for an employer. You know what? I'm going to discriminate just a little bit. As Wilfred said, it's not a huge difference, right? You get these arguments that it's huge. It's not that big. It might still be a problem. I'm open to that one. And also, it might just be a problem on fairness grounds. Even if discrimination is rational, we could debate that. But that there are enormous affirmative action preferences at elite universities. And large. Now, universities do a good job keeping this secret or hiding it in this Byzantine structure that is very difficult. How large the advantages or the preferences are. The data we have, they're pretty large. We also, thanks to Charles Murray's analysis of the NL data, that if you take people jobs and you compare the black to the white worker, on average, the white worker has somewhere around an 8 to 10 point IQ advantage for the same job. Furthermore, we know from two that if you look at jobs, you look at employers, the white workers are rated about 0.3 standard deviations higher job performance on both subjective and objective, importantly. So this isn't, and the subjective and very well. So this isn't, you could say, oh yeah, so he says the white worker's better. We have objective measures of this, kinds of productivity, are they late, do they leave on time, et cetera, right? All of those data together, I think, paint a pretty clear picture of American society. And it's one that's not systemically racist against black people. In fact, if anything, I think you could argue that it's tilted a little bit against white people now. Now, having said that, just to, I think there are individual white people who, and I wouldn't want to be a black person. I was, an example, I was in an area in Virginia and there were a lot of Confederate flags around. White people. I would not have wanted to be black there. I would have felt unwelcomed and probably there was prejudice there. But it's important to distinguish attitudes from the system as a whole. And as a whole, the systemic racism claim, not only is it wrong, it's the opposite of the truth.
Okay. That was a mouthful, and I know our scientists on the panel want to get in. I want to say a couple things. One, I'm going to wait till later because I know we're going to get into that. But I will approach it because I don't think I said what I thought. I think it's like Will said. It kind of depends on the situation. But I will admit to Bo's point that the situations where that exists are becoming larger. So Tade said it's the top and the bottom. But the more we change and the more the culture shifts to this, cultural, these racial binaries, where it's this or that. And if you say the wrong thing, you're out. But you can say the same thing and you be black, because we can go beyond just, jobs. We can go to the things that you can say. I was, just talking to somebody, and we joke about the things. Well, if you say that as a black person, you can say it. If you say it as a white person, you get in trouble. So you have that. I think we were on another podcast, another episode, and Will was talking about that I think it was with Chi Brown. You were talking about that, how, there's problems in different communities, but they're different. But whites may approach it one way and blacks may approach it another way. But in the greater, like if all the other people who are outside of it, your upper middle class blacks and whites are looking in at it, there are things that you can do that you can't do. I don't know if it's the same number of things that a white person can do that that black person can't do. I'm not saying nothing exists. The situation you mentioned out in the woods is one thing, but in the mainstream, there aren't many things that go the other way. And then when you talk, so when I say situational, it doesn't necessarily just mean the jobs. You talk about the university, so you got this pipeline. So obviously they're going to go somewhere. There are also Fortune 500 companies for at least a decade who have been, incentivizing whether they do it because they think it's the right thing to do, or they want to get some checks on some, some positive outlook that may or may not exist. But I know I worked in a couple of these companies and they just cheer. They put it on the wall. Look at how many blacks we hired today. It's kind of a bragging right thing for a lot of them. And then Will touched on it briefly at the end. Then there's the government. Now the government, you got to step back and say, whoa, because we could all just close our eyes and think about our interactions with the government and say the clerks when we go to the courthouse. We can say the mailman. We can say the DMV. In all those places we go, and well, I can't say that, but I would say it is definitely so diverse that you have to assume that it's by intent. I was going to say something about a recent trip I took to the library, and I'm like, wow, how did they get everyone represented? It was fascinating. I mean, there's a guy in a wheelchair, there's an octogenarian, there are old black people. There's everything. It's like, wow, you would never see this in a corporate boardroom. You would never see this at McDonald's, right? You wouldn't see this anywhere. So there's that. But I will let them all respond, and I'm going to get back, because, we were talking about IQ. I have a point I want to make about IQ, which was my last point. But does anybody want to rebut or have a comment to what Bo said?
We agree, as it were.
No, I think I do, because what I was wondering when he was talking, like, I don't think I would feel like I wouldn't want to be black if I was around a lot of white people with Confederate flags and things like that, which gives me the question about class, because I feel like I'm very comfortable around white people that may be a little bit more redneckish, I guess, or considered that way, than I would a group of. I would be more afraid to walk through an elite white neighborhood and be black, because I would just automatically think that they felt some kind of way about a black girl, or, walking through their elite neighborhood, than I would say hanging out in a trailer park with people, with Confederate flags. So that's a question that I'm like, okay, is that about class, or, because that wouldn't bother me at all. I don't think, I've been in areas where it's been heavily populated with, Confederate flags, and I haven't felt afraid.
But I just want to say, just to be clear, I'm not trying to say those people were necessarily bad, and maybe they think the Confederate flag is like, yay, slavery and the Confederacy. I don't think they think of it. Interesting what you're saying. I as a class white dude, I just think too black, I wouldn't feel comfortable here, but so.
Yeah,
And
I will
I'm
say,
sorry.
just there are, in, for example, the Appalachian region of the country that you probably don't want to spend a lot of time in if you are black. I mean, and I think I see a dramatic amount of racial hate crime there because there aren't any black people. Very few black people that are going to go to a desperately poor white neighborhood and just wander around until they get into a brawl. But I mean, of course, there are. This is one of the reasons why there's not that much interracial crime. The same thing's true in reverse.
Right.
I mean, there are very few white guys that are going to go, unless in high school or something, that are just going to go to the projects and hang out for a day. I would say the danger in some of the Appalachian hollers might be higher, but they're even harder to get to. There's no chance of an black person outside of the shopping center of one of the few towns really being there and having a chance at that violence. But one thing I want to very quickly say about this, when we're talking about racism, where Bo says there might be a 5% level of bias against whites, or I'm saying the audit studies show 7% against blacks or something like this. One of the things that we're all kind of tacitly admitting is that in modern, say, dating life or social life, there's not an extraordinary amount of racism. I think that the one serious point the CRT left does make is about the impact of the past. So there are two levels to this. Racism within a society from two different perspective points. One, you took a middle-class individual of African society, like, say, Ghana, and you brought him into the USA, student in maths or physics or something like that. Would life look any different from that of his white classmates? I'd probably agree with Bo on that. No. Maybe that 5 to 10% advantage is where he got hired. The issue, though, is when you look at things that affect performance, like test scores, certainly like father present, SES, some of that, not necessarily so much with slavery, but with, for example, Jim Crow, the idiotic left-wing programs like the welfare state, a real number on the black family. So there are, even within the same state or at the same level of test performance or something, going to be fewer black people that are competitively ready, certainly Hispanics, many of whom simply are white, that are competitive, are going to be mainstream Anglo-Americans that are an example of this. So the average white family has like 10 times the wealth of the average black family. Now, some of this is BS. That's cut by about half if you just remove the billionaires. A lot just means the white family owns a cheap house while the black family has 3 more years remaining to pay theirs off. There are always ways to play with this data. But the overarching fact, the average white family has more wealth than the average Asian family. Like, stuff like that definitely does tie into the past. Today, I think most of this is just whining and navel-gazing. We have an obligation to repay groups no one could really dispute suffered, Hispanics in the Deep South. Do we have a duty, natives, to do anything for them? This is a real question that honorable people can discuss.
I think we do, personally. So I guess I can jump in there.
You mentioned that.
Yeah, I think we do. And my argument is, as Wilford says, right, so the wealth gap is pretty exaggerated, especially when you think about like single parents, right? And what is a family. But what's interesting is I have a friend, a black guy in Texas, and he owns a house. And you hear about this more and more. Like in the last 10 years, I've heard about the wealth gap way more. And the scary thing about it is everyone's aware of this now, right? And you hear all these numbers like 10 to 1. And it's probably 4 to 1, and it's real, but it's probably exaggerated, right? I mean, it is exaggerated, but it exists. And so this guy needs to rent out his house. And if you're going to rent your house out to, say, some kids who just graduated college, they have an entry-level job, there's a sort of uncertain economy, there's a rent, there's an eviction moratorium, and you know, 22-year-olds can lose their jobs quick, right? Like things change, like the economy's strained, there's COVID, there's all these things, and you have 2 black kids and 2 white kids. Who are you going to pick, right? Because we know that for 22-year-olds, their emergency fund is their parents, and black or white, you probably are going to bet that the white kids are going to be more able to tap into that, right? To have familial wealth to tap into to pay rent if they lose their job. So you'll discriminate against them, right? And it's sort of unfortunate, right? Because if you didn't view everything through this lens of race, that discrimination might not take place or would be a lot less, or would be confined to the working class. I was telling a friend when I looked for an apartment here, when I was south of Penn, the people that were trying to rent were basically telling me that as long as I stay south of, I think, Wilshire, there wouldn't be too many Hispanics. And then when I went up there, they were telling me as long as I stayed north of Venice, there wouldn't be too many black people, right? So, I mean, you hear that it would sort of be confined to sort of the stereotypes, right? And so that's why I would say, yeah, like, we don't want to have a strong correlation between the color of your skin and being able to infer how much money that your parents had. Because as long as that's there, people will discriminate. And so that's why I think that I don't necessarily believe that a racial like reparation should happen, but I think inheritance should be redistributed to all people. because I don't think it matters, right, why your parents have suffered, right? If your dad's a schizophrenic, you're gonna have disadvantages, right? Big disadvantages. And when you're 40, you're gonna be probably paying for your dad to get out of jail again. And if your dad's not a schizophrenic, you're gonna inherit a bunch of money. And I don't really think. I think to normalize that would be a good thing. I think to normalize familial wealth between the generations would be a positive move, but not just across race, across all things. I think anybody whose family doesn't have as much wealth, it's not their fault. Basically. And you have to reset the game, right? Like in Monopoly, you start over each time. Right? So I think a good time to start the game over is when you die. Personally.
Wow. That's for another episode, because we can go for another hour just talking about that.
I don't, yeah.
But I do want to. I mean, we're not in a rush, but I know I got a special point I want to go with both Tade and Bo, and I want to make sure we at least get it in. One, I guess I'll start with Bo since Tade just ended. And twice you mentioned, I said I was going to go back to this IQ test. You talked about the difference when you were talking about how blacks have an advantage and they use the audit, and you were talking about the different data out there that indicate that they have lower performance and the lower IQ. And then when we were talking about IQ in general, the mean IQ for different races and different groups of people. I think you said for the working, when they did the measurement of people working, you said it's about 5 to 7. And across races, like black to white, it's about 15. So I guess for those of us who don't study this, the question would be, we hear these numbers all the time, whether it's, Genius has a 187 IQ, this person has, 135, the average is 97 for these people. But no one has a reference point. So I'm a numbers guy. It's like, you got to give me all the numbers to understand that. So I guess the question most people want to know, but they don't know they want to know it, is at what point is it a big difference? So is a 15-point difference a big difference? Does 7 points really matter? So talk about that a bit.
It's a good question, and I would say it depends on whether we're thinking about an individual or a group. Because a 5-point difference, okay, so it's set at 100, the mean is. Points is a standard deviation. The black standard deviation, the African-American IQ, Wilfred will dispute this a little bit. There's debate in the literature in 85 and 92. The white is America. It's set at 100 in Britain. It's a standard deviation.
Okay.
For an individual might be almost. In fact, I just read a funny quote from Arthur, one of my intellectual heroes, a great psychologist. He said, I wouldn't pay $5 to increase my IQ by 5 points. But if you're looking at a group, it matters a lot, because if you shift the average IQ by 5 points, you're shifting the percentage of who are in the 130 and above, like say the gifted to genius range, you're increasing that actually dramatically.
Well, that's only if it's actually normally distributed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So that's because it's forced to be normal, right? So that you don't actually know that. It's important. Right. Yeah.
It has, yeah, fair enough. So distribution, if you shift 5 points, you get this effect, assuming the normal distribution, which it's. But for an individual, 5 points, as much personally, I would pay money for 5 points. I'm not like Johnson, $1,000 to get 5 more points. It's hard to say exactly where it would mean something, but I do think that it does mean something. I think it's disingenuous for people to argue that it doesn't have real world consequences, because IQ, in my view, it's perhaps the best construct in all of psychology. The greatest discovery of psychology, and it predicts all sorts of things in the world, crime rates, etc., obviously socioeconomic status, academic success, etc. That said, I will just say this part, which is, Tade was talking about this, and I do think this is important. He was saying this about athletics, where people have these stereotypes, and they're maybe people don't think, oh well, you have no dignity as a human, you're worthless or whatever. Whereas people do have this feeling about IQ, I think, right? They think, notice that there's almost no term that you can use to describe somebody with low IQ that doesn't sound like an insult. Dull, stupid. I mean, all of these things, they're like insults on your entire character. So I think that's the hard thing, is that we have to accept, one, that IQ is really important, that it matters, but also that it's not the same thing as human dignity, and that there are plenty of decent people who have 70 IQs, and you have horrible, malicious, malevolent people who have.
Well, see, I gotta. So, because you said that, unlike Arthur, you would pay $5 for the
Yes.
maybe $10,000. So, right, 5,000.
Yes.
A point.
Yep.
So, that begs the question of, what do you think your benefit? Obviously, you're paying for it because you think there's going to be a benefit. So, what do you think the benefit is? So, I asked that, but I have to add this piece. Does that 5, now obviously the 5, like Tade said, depends on where it is, right? So a 5-point difference, you're talking about shifting the whole mean, but individual, and now you admitted that individual is different, but you still said you would take the 5 points.
Yes.
So I'm saying 70 to 75 is different from 103 to 108.
Yes.
So,
yes, it is.
So it also depends, if you were talking about career opportunities, what you're going to do. There's certain jobs that we can
Right.
get into, what type of thinking that job entails. So why do you think it would be advantage, knowing all that, for you to have an additional 5 points?
Well, and I think a good way, if you're familiar with baseball, like a fastball, it's between a 60 mile per hour fastball is not really that much. The difference between 90 and 95 is a lot, right? It's a lot harder to hit. It's way harder to throw. It puts you up in this elite category. So, like, difference between 85 and 100, I'm not saying this for practical purposes, although it has some practical consequences. Like, if you can get the extra at the end there, that probably matters more. We could look at,
would depend on what your IQ is now. So
yeah, exactly.
I don't know if you know yours, but when you say I would pay for an extra 5.
Yeah.
So what if my IQ is 83?
Right.
Right. So then
I'd give like
then
5.
I'm not at that 90.
You get 5.
What'd you say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty smart. I don't think that if I moved from, and I'm not going to like announce my IQ, but I think if I moved from whatever to X plus 5, I don't think there'd be all that much of a difference in terms of these publications. One very quickly, I think, and I want to hear Tade's response to this question, some of the engagement here, but I do think the primary question that people would ask Bo is, what percent of this do you think is genetic?
Yes.
And why?
That's where I was going to go.
And I think Tade would respond perhaps a little differently to that. Just as a very quick note, IQ itself is a lot more malleable than people seem to think. So, I mean, the term is sometimes used a little casually, but the tested IQ of the world, G factor is a little different, but the tested IQ of the world increased about 18 points during the latter half of the past century. IQs of a number of other groups, Polish Jews in the USA, Irishmen in Ireland, so on, increased at a minimum 15 points on top of that. And
they were lower, right? Like the Irish, they were lower than the averages here, right?
Yeah.
Well,
famously.
The OG Tom Sowell points out people took the Army Alpha and Beta. Shout to the goat. But when people took the Army Alpha and Beta, in all seriousness, around the time of World War I believe Beta would be primarily World War II, the scores for many white groups, I mean, Irishmen, Italians, Polish people, which was a proxy for Jews at that time, so on, were very high, up through high 80s, while the white average, if you look at individuals, about 100. So there really is a debate. Everyone would agree IQ has some value. And I actually find it people try to pretend this is not the case. It doesn't matter what you got on the thing. That's obviously the biggest predictor of how you're going to do in college. If you're a middle-class kid, it's something you're probably pretty competitive about, although I wasn't. I lived in the hood at this time. But, I mean, that is how trainable is it? If every point smarter, what contributed to that? Even small racial gaps at the end could now make everyone 20 more points smarter. So there's a whole lot to this debate. But I mean, I next question for these guys would be, what do you think is genetic within? But Charles, I think you had a follow-up
No,
question.
that's where I was going to go. I was going to go to genetics. That was the thing. Yep.
Boom, smooth segue.
So
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
before I talk about that, I kind of want to bring something else up about the utility of IQ, right? So an example I give my students sometimes is imagine a construct called AQ, right? So this is like athletic quotient. And humans are not great athletes, right? We're really smart. We're like the smartest animal, but we're not. We don't run fast. We don't jump high. So since we're not great athletes, we should be able to sum up how athletic we are in one number. And if you think about, at least in America, right, in our major sports, our most successful athletes, I guess in the last championships, let's see, Tom Brady would probably be the best football player, best basketball player, even though he didn't win, I would still say LeBron James. And the best baseball player right now might be that Japanese guy, I forget his name. Yeah, so if you can give a number where all three, like some battery of tests where all three of those guys will score extremely high because they clearly have really high AQ. Well, you can't do it, right? Because obviously they don't share a lot physically. But that's a little unfair, right? It seems like, oh, well, so there's no AQ, so IQ is BS. But that's not true, right? Tom Brady is slow because but that still puts him like faster than probably 90% of men. Right. So what you see is you actually could make a metric where none of those guys are bad, right? And that's how I look at IQ, right? It's there is, and I think I have a pretty good insight, not from genetics, but because in college I worked as a tutor, right? So I taught the LSAT, the SAT, the GRE, the MCAT. Like I taught all those tests, and it made me sort of believe in. When I practiced them, I could ace them all, which is sort of why I got that job, right? But it took some practice, and there were students I had that couldn't get better, would sort of get stuck. There were, and there were students who were sort of a little bit past them, with a lot of practice could get better. So I think, like AQ is not actually useful at all to predict who's going to succeed in professional sports. It does tell you who can't be a professional athlete, right? You can't run a 6.5 40 and have any position in professional. You just can't do it. So I think that IQ, and this is also true. Right? This is just true if you look at wealth, if you look at income. The correlation is strong because having low IQ is correlated with a lot of really bad outcomes, right? So if we take the bottom half of the distribution, it's incredibly important. I mean, personally, like I'd spend $5,000 to get 2/10 off my 100-meter time. But I wouldn't spend any money on my IQ because it's really important at the bottom. And I don't think I think if you look at the data, it's really hard to sum up the benefit of going from a 120 to 125 IQ, or whether that even means anything intellectually. And I can say, not based test at my colleagues who are all academics, none of them are stupid. I'd say, they're all probably smarter than average. But the most successful of us are not smartest of us, not even close, right? I'd say it could be inversely correlated, right? So once you sort of move up in an organization, you see that talent, or sort of intellectual ability, if that exists, becomes less and less important, right? So there's some political guile that seems to really matter, right? So I would say, yeah, but I do think it's really important, I would say, not to look at the mean IQs, but to look at the number of sort of black students in high school test with a really low IQ. I think that disparity does matter. Right? So that's where I'll agree with Bo. I mean, I don't think I don't think it's genes that cause that, but I will say yes. Like the people that say we should just that we should just ignore IQ or the standardized tests, I disagree. Right? I think students with really low test scores is a problem, and if there's a racial disparity in as far as the percentage of students that have low test scores, that needs to be addressed. That really does matter, right? But now to get into the genes, right? So if we look at the genetic arguments behind this, this is a little bit more complicated. We don't see good evidence when we look at so is everyone on this panel familiar with the concept of PRS? No, yes.
PRS?
PRS.
No.
Okay, so let me give a little gene background for everybody, right? So before we had the genome, right, we figured out that genes matter, right? So we'll give a classic example that everyone knows, sickle cell anemia, right? So that's a single mutation, and we figured this out in the 70s, before we even had the genome. And I think it's 9% of people who identify as black in the U.S. are carrier for it, right? So it's 9 times 9, so it's 0.08, so around 1%, a little under 1% of black people are going to have 2 copies of that if they mate perfectly randomly. But that's not too bad of an assumption, right? So this is a genetic mutation that changes the shape of your blood cells, and you carry oxygen not as well. And if you look across the world, what is really interesting when we talk about race is this is distributed in, I think the mutation started in Kenya 7,000 years ago. It spread throughout Central Africa and West Africa. It didn't really get to South Africa, although now it's there because of recent immigration that happened within Africa. It's also in Bahrain, it's in Greece, but not Italy, and it's in India, which means that these people share an ancestor within 7,000 years, right? Which is sort of destroys this idea of race that we're all separated 20,000 years ago. But anyway, this gene matters, right? It matters for your blood. But you don't ever hear anyone in the U.S. say, oh, black people, their blood oxygenation, the mean's a little worse. Because since we understand the gene, we just say that black people have a higher prevalence of sickle cell anemia. If you're black and you don't have that, then you don't have it at all, right? So we don't really look at the mean there. So there's a few examples like that where we find these single mutations that really matter. And then for all these complex traits, and complex traits are height, diabetes, educational attainment, which is sort of like the analog for IQ. It's sort of the more PC version, right? We don't have single genes. It's failed. And I don't know if that's because we haven't done a good job, or we can't disentangle culture, or there's just not a big enough impact. But basically what happened is, 10, 15 years ago, some guy said, okay, there's no single mutation that determines your IQ or your educational attainment. But what if I look at all the mutations that have some really small effect, right? So you imagine that there's a mutation in some part of the chromosome. Unfortunately, it's usually not in a gene, so it's somewhere else. But there's a mutation in, let's say, just to make the numbers real simple, you take 100 people and 50 of them have the mutation, 50 of them don't. The 50 of them that have it are, say, slightly taller, or slightly higher IQ, or slightly higher on some trait, right? So you look across the entire genome and you come up with a collection of, say, 1,000 different spots. And these 1,000 spots are associated with some trait. So what you can do is you can take your genome, right? So take Charles' genome and all the spots where this allele would predict a higher IQ, I'm going to give him sort of a plus score, and if he has the one that predicts the lower one, I'm going to give him, I'm going to take away his score, and at the end he's going to have a score. And we say, okay, that's his genetically predicted IQ. So we call that your polygenic risk score. It's really it's polygenic, right? Because it takes a lot of spots on the genome, and it predicts your trait. So this is where all the heritability studies from IQ come from. I mean, there's some old twin studies, but those are really underpowered, and those have some other problems that we don't need to talk about. But the new studies that you'll see all involve this idea. So what you see is when you try to take a polygenic risk analysis between two populations, it fails. And for example, if you take a height prediction analysis, right? So you can predict the height of a European person. So you can give me a European person, I take his blood, I get his genome, I can tell you how tall he is. Obviously, it's not perfect, but I can predict it somewhat well. Of course, there's always exceptions, right? So if he's a dwarf, it's going to be a single mutation. So his polygenic risk doesn't tell me how tall he is, right? But you can do a decent job. So I can take that same construct, take it to people in Africa, and it's going to predict that they're about 4 feet tall. And we know that's not true. So it doesn't work. And so there was this big thing, where people are like, why doesn't that work? And, is it that the mutations that make black people tall versus short, are they different? Is it a genetic difference? So what's happened recently is we've taken these same studies and we've tried to port them across two populations that are genetically similar. So, for example, an Irish working class population and a Scottish elite population. And they also don't port. So what it's telling us is that polygenic risk doesn't help us predict trait across populations, whether or not there's a difference in genetic background between those populations. So that's a really long, complicated way to say what Wilfred would agree with, that you can't see past culture, right? As long as there's culture, it just overwhelms the data, right? And even if there's an allele, if you imagine that, your parents have some allele that makes them slightly smarter, and because of that, they attend college. So you inherit that allele. So that makes you slightly smarter. But it also makes you way more likely to inherit parents who went to college, which is a huge which really impact your outcome. But then in a population where they don't go to college, that allele is not going to matter as much, right? So we see that these alleles don't do the same thing across all populations. So that's a long way of saying that until you get rid of culture, you can't do genetics. Although my one caveat is that the polygenic risks, they port well for things that we don't care about, right? So if you want to see genes, there's two ways to see genes. Don't care about a trait, right? So if everyone doesn't care about whether they go to school or their IQ, then you might see a genetic difference in IQ. And the example I love to give is female hand grip strength. So female hand grip strength ports well between populations, but it's also something that people are barely aware of. Even male hand grip strength does not port as well, right? And then the other example is that if everybody, trains really, really hard, or some subpopulation of people train really, really hard at education, and we only look at them, maybe we'll see genes. And that's to give, the example about the long distance runners that Wilfred gave, right? So if there's 1 million guys in Kenya trying to run really fast. There's 1 million guys in China trying to run really fast. And if they all put all of their life into this one trait, then you might see where genetics will have an influence. So for traits, for us to basically detect this, we need to have everybody, or some population of people that are the same size, spend all their time doing this thing, or we have to ignore it. And things like education and IQ are just totally the opposite, right? Because they matter, that's all we think about. So I would say that culture overwhelms genetics for all polygenic traits. That's the short answer to the long story.
Well, doesn't that all fly in the face of the argument of, I won't just say the proponents of CRT, but all of those who argue, not the systemic part, because the system is separate, it has nothing to do with genetics. They're saying there's a problem with the system. But those who say disparate impacts are due to certain characteristics that's beyond an individual's control.
Well, okay, so my problem with the whole CRT thing is, of course they're right? But I just I don't know for the individual
I had to laugh
how much it matters.
Right, I'm sorry.
No, they're correct, right? So if there was no slavery, like let's say there's a black guy right now who's in prison, but for slavery he would not be in prison. That's true. It's also true that none of us would be alive, right? It's a silly argument, right? But it's true, right? They say had there not been this past racism, this disparity wouldn't exist. True, right? But that's the problem, right? So the example of the Ghanaian incomes, right? So this is an example that should sort of beat the HBD arguments, right? To say, well, these people genetically aren't so different from Black Americans and they're doing well. Should also sort of fly in the face of CRT, because it's like these people are Black and they're doing well. But they can also say, well, no, this is proof. This is proof, because the only difference between these people and African Americans is slavery. So therefore, slavery caused the difference, right? So I mean, this is the problem: is like when you're giving advice to your friend on how to do well, or when you're looking at the world in total. Yeah, sure, past is prologue, but like does that matter, right? Like all that matters for us is can you make it, right? And that's where I don't agree with them. But sure, they're telling a story, they're telling a story, and that story, all of history matters. If it wasn't for the past, everything would be different. That's true, but it's just, it doesn't matter.
Well,
one comment there, I actually, when I and do anything quantitative. I find that both HB culturalism at least have kind of predictive value if you're looking at where groups fit in America. I don't think CRT does if you in blacks. Like if you look at the 10, I mean, they're mostly Asian, Jewish, West African. South Africans are the top 10. West Africans are not in the top 10, but they're pretty close. Yeah. Pretty close too. So I mean, there's just no way to, I'm coming up with a hypothetical top 5 of Indians, 2 Japanese, 3 Nigerians, 4 Jews. 5 here. There's just no way to say that although our actual top 5 is due to current or past. I mean, Chinese Americans, other than maybe blacks and than any group in this country. I mean, the group that's most 9/11 Arabs by far. Top 20. One of you guys might correct me. So I just don't. Even for Black Americans, I mean, if you look at the start, these major things like family income gaps within, a lot of those date back to not. I mean, in 1945, the Black quote 10%, they date back to the massive experimentation in the 1960s. So I made kind of coherent, intelligent point so far. The one thing I'm disagreeing with, I don't think that explanation holds up. I actually debated reparations on a kind of, and people were making this point, like without reparations, we would have, or without, the argument was pretty weak actually, but it's sort of without and a mule here, we would have had an equal starting base. Oh, my brother, without slavery in the old wars, like you're in Congo or wherever. Like it's very hard to of history, but I don't find CRT 50 all that. Yeah, no, good point. Yeah, but I don't find CRT 1950 say to be very predictive at all. Charles, you might have asked a question here.
Go ahead. Go ahead, of course. Where'd you go?
I think he paused.
Right on his question. He's literally stuck there. Look
Yep, he's stuck.
So while he's
good, I can
ask his question
can
afterwards. Can I say something real quick? Because I'll lose it if I don't.
Absolutely.
Because one good thing that Will say, I agree with everything he says. Mm-hmm. I respect and appreciate Tade's point. But I like to look at the landscape and say and use examples and tell stories, but use ones that everyone else doesn't use. So Will gave us top 5, making the point of minorities still making it here, irregardless of this. I mean, regardless of race and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. But the lesser talked about piece that I think is even clearer, give the CRT people their argument on race and what would happen. They always talk about what would happen to the blacks if it wasn't for this race. Okay, this slavery and everything that happened in Jim Crow. Here's the better point, I think, anyway. If that's the case, and you say, but for slavery, blacks would be where, how do they explain poor whites? Poor whites
They're
were
just
slaves.
spectacular failures. Like,
Right.
we have
so
all
that's
this.
What I'm saying. So poor whites were slaves. So
Wait,
what they're saying is,
I actually think that's a really good example. No, wait. So I think one thing that we haven't talked about, that we just missed from the conversation, right? We've talked about, I think Will said that there's 3, right? He talked about CRT, and I don't know what CRT is. I think it's hard to define, but we're using CRT, to sort of fit as this sort of, I guess, on the left argument about how to explain current disparities, right? And we talked about these 2 arguments on the right? And one argument is this genetic argument, and the other argument is a cultural argument. I think the cultural argument would probably include right? So it would say that the Great Society from the 1970s had a negative influence on black outcomes, right? So I would say that we see that we have 2 conservative arguments, right? So one involves culture and basically bad policy. Basically, the culture was made worse by the government misbehaving, and then the even more extreme right is the genetic, right? So I would say that's a scientific racism argument, right? And we talk about one argument on the left, which is this argument that it's this persistent racism that continues to exist And that's why there's these gaps, right? But I think the problem with this is that we're forgetting a big argument that's on the left. There's really 4 arguments, right? So we have 2 on the right, we have 1 on the left, right? And if we look at the data, right? So if we look at white and black outcomes from, say, 1945 to 1955, and what we see is that poor whites did much better than poor blacks. So poor whites used the GI Bill, which blacks did not have any access to, and
so
they did really well. And they left the tenements, they left the projects, they got jobs in unions, and they moved to the suburbs, and that was the start of like the middle class. And then black people got those same rights in the late 60s, only they didn't make those gains. And one thing that's really important is the whites that were still poor in the 60s also didn't make those gains. And that's what everybody forgets, right? And there was a you know, to use this word, there was a systematic change. There was, you know, deindustrialization, right? There was jobs were gone, factories closed, and, you know, which is why Trump had this weird appeal to people when he said he was going to reopen these factories. Of course, that didn't happen, right? But there was this sort of path out that closed up around the civil rights movement. And which is a sort of, I mean, if you believe in conspiracy theories, you can think it closed up for the civil rights movement. But at the very least, it's a really unfortunate coincidence. I think it sort of destroys the discourse. Because what we see is, oh wow, people in America from 1945 to the, you know, maybe 1959 or 65, or, you know, I'm not going to argue there, you know, there's a path out. And then once the black people sort of get rights to have their path out, it's gone. Right? So it makes it look like, so if you don't realize that path closed in, like, at that same time, because it closed for whites too. Like, white poor people did not make those gains anymore. From 1965 to 1975, poor whites did not make the economic gains that they made from 45 to 55. But if you ignore that, it looks like, wow, why can't black people make the same gains? It worked for white people. The GI Bill worked for whites. Why did civil rights allow black people to move from the ghettos to the suburbs? And so there's a simple explanation, but we sort of go to these complex stories. Well, it must be because there's this continued racism, or it must be because there's a genetic difference, or it must be because the welfare state destroyed them. And I mean, that's of the arguments. I'm the most sympathetic to that one, because I think there's a such thing as bad policy. But I think the overriding argument is that, you know, from 65 on, it was harder for all people, black or white, to go from poor to class. And that's the truth. And that unfortunate coincidence, I think, is why we have these 4. That's why we give like a lot. Why we respect arguments that are a little bit silly, because there's a coincidence of systemic change for the country that coincides with the civil rights movement, which unfortunately like makes people confused. That's my thesis on that.
You're back, Will. Did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So first, apparently I'm a Marriott frequent traveler, some such horse shit, but my room had internet for a day or something like that as a result of this. And so when I got dropped, I opened up a new tab, and it said something like, do you want to upgrade to being a Marriott Gold frequent traveler member so you can do
You're
this?
Black man, upgrade.
Well, I actually did end up paying for an extra whatever period of internet so I could do this in my business meetings tomorrow, because otherwise I'd just be sitting here with a rock in computer form. But anyway, so that's basically what was going on with me. Good to see you guys again. Let me actually open up this other screen. All right, my other Riverside should be 100% uploaded now, so you should have the entire time I'm on here. Otherwise, it'd be an enormous pain in the ass, especially for Charles. But I guess the question was a very simple one, because one of the things that we've been talking about, or really kind of the theme of the episode today, is, you know, IQ, genes, HBD, if you call it whatever. And I mean, Tade, from your reply there, it seems like you pretty much think, at least in a measurable sense, that IQ gaps between groups are 0% genetic. Is that correct?
What groups, I guess?
Well, yeah, so I want to ask you and then Bo this question, but like, not like dumb people and smart people or something like that. But I mean, if we're talking about the currently tested IQ gaps in the U.S., in the world, which actually go well beyond American whites and blacks. I mean, the lowest tested score I've seen is Aboriginal Australians at like 63. This goes all the way up to European Ashkenaz Jews at like 119. I'm inclined to think there may be some small genetic influence on the extreme margins, but that West African, Asian, white gaps are massively cultural. This would be my opinion. But when it comes to gaps like this, West African, Asian, white in the USA, what percentage of that do you think is genetic?
Me?
Yeah.
Let's see. So I don't think if there is a such thing as IQ, right? So if you imagine that there's some intellectual ability, and we qualify it as sort of some innate potential. I imagine that if that exists, I don't necessarily think it's normally distributed between black people, right? So if you look at height, for example, right? Like here's a simple question for all these people: who's taller, black or white people? Does anybody know? And let's just, to make it simple, let's call black people everybody in Africa, and everybody in Europe is going to be called white.
Not to be for West African black people, I think we've got whites by an inch. Like that. Somebody did measure that.
Okay, yeah, right. But
either one.
It's not super informative.
Right? A lot of people tend to be tall.
What's that?
A lot tend to be tall.
I didn't hear that first word.
Sudanese people and all that.
Melodic people.
What's
Can
that
you hear
mean?
me?
Melodic?
Am I not?
Melodic. He said
NILOTIC.
Oh,
melodic people.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the tallest people in the world, the tallest country in the world is Denmark. The tallest people in the world are the Maasai, right? And their average height is like 6'6". And Danes are like 6 foot, right? So if you go by country, it's Dane. If you go by group, it's Maasai. And in that same country, you have Mbuti, which are like 4 feet tall, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't necessarily have a normal distribution of height in Africa, right? So I would argue that if there's some important intellectual capability, if there's a difference in potential between Black Americans, white Americans, and Asian Americans, the mean is uninteresting because I don't see why the distribution would be normal. But also what I said, I don't know if it was heard by Wilfred, but again, it will only matter if the culture doesn't care about it, or the culture cares about it more, which is, my argument is, okay, these HBD people think that white people are smarter, that's fine. Let's care about it more, and then we'll see, right? So let's put a bunch of resources towards getting everybody's standardized test scores higher. So, I mean, people laugh at Ibram Kendi because he says, we should attack all disparities, and I think he's right. I just think he skips the disparity, right? So he skips the test scores. He goes to college admission. And I would just say, no, let's get the test score disparity fixed. Because if you fix a disparity and move on, that doesn't make sense. But when you see a disparity, you should fix it. So let's put a bunch, if all three of these groups put equal time towards doing their homework, which we know that they don't, then the could be genetic, right? Well, so I'd love to see them. And the only way that we'd see them is if... What's up?
That's kind of what I'm asking you, though. I mean, and I think that, and then I'd be interested in Bo's response to this. I'm a culturalist, so I agree with you. I think that the glaring, Bo and I argue about this famously all the time. To me, the glaring disparity when you look at just basic study, which charter schools, for example, close. Like I recently looked at charter school SAT scores, and these are mostly working class kids on both sides, so they weren't all that high. But the average was something like 1042 for black students, 1087 for white students. So I think you might still see some small gaps even with everything equalized. But I mean, there's obviously a massive difference in black, white, Asian study time in school. But I mean, so it sounds like you're saying that, again, this is very small. You don't think there are substantial genetic gaps between groups.
No, I don't. Yeah. I mean,
it sounds like he's saying if it is, the only way to know it is to make everything else equal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I welcome that. I mean, if white people are if Charles Murray is writing books about the 8-point SAT advantage that whites have, I'd be happy, right? If he's the average white kid gets a 1208 and the average black kid only gets a 1200, okay, fine. Right? I'd be
Okay,
happy because the average black kid's getting a 1200, right? So
I
to
think
me,
we're
that's
we're
fine.
actually on almost totally the same page, and really the last part of what became a longer than I expected question, but would be for both. And just in the interest of fairness, I mean, what do you think? What percentage of the current large groups, West African, Asian, white, USA and Europe gap, call it 11 points, do you think is genetic, and why?
I would say that 20%, and I don't know where beyond that. So I'm giving a huge range. Genes I would put it this way, genes play a role in these gaps, and I think there's a lot of indirect evidence that supports that. We also have admixture studies, which we could talk about. I also want to, Tade and I would disagree about does IQ a certain point. I think the empirical evidence is pretty clear. It's still predictive, even above 130. We can for that. Also, it's important to note that if there's an intelligence, there is. Mental abilities are correlated. That's just an empirical fact. So it happens to be the case that the mental ability test 1, mental ability test 3, mental ability test 4, right? That's just a fact of the world. So that we can extract a factor from that. We call Wilfred was talking about Flynn effect. Flynn effect's very fascinating and absolutely, almost certainly, mostly cultural or environmental. Some people have proposed that there are biological variables, nutrition, that matter. So famously, Lynn has argued that nutrition. But this is a huge effect. IQ gains about across the 20th century, about 3 points per decade, somewhere around there, a little bit less. This, to properly discuss into the G factor, because there's a question about whether and how much that matters, right? But just, I will concede a point to Will, the culturalist here. I will concede that IQ is probably more malleable than some HBDers seem to suggest, and that you do get large adoption gains, for example, and there's the Flynn effect. We don't know exactly what that means, but that's a huge effect. And there are some interventions that have effects. However, and this I think is really important because people who don't know this literature probably don't know this, we have spent 80 years trying to close this gap. It's not as around just thinking like, somebody should try to close. We've spent lots of money. We've had the Milwaukee project, many other projects, Head Start, for example. The end result of all of these, and I'm trying to be like is sort of conservative, is that you don't get any real. So Head Start fades out. We know this. ABC Darien project. This was a project that took babies at 4.4 months of age, 6 to 8 hours a day. This educational daycare, 5 days. It was 350 days a year until they were 5 or 6. There's debate about what happened, but if there was it wasn't very much. Now that's a very cultural intervention. I mean, we're not just talking about somebody to talk to for a couple hours a week or you put them in school. We're talking about massive interventions here. Many other interventions we could talk about. Those interventions is they aren't terribly G. So then the question is, well, if culture's doing something, why can't we replicate it? And the answer might be, well, we just haven't figured out the important causal variable. Or the answer might be, a lot of these gains aren't G. They're specific testing games. The method isn't working the way, in other words, we're measure with the thing we're trying to measure, right? Like you might get gains, but it might not actually be in the underlying we should care about, in my view. There's debate into that. So that's my view. It's probably I would say 50% is the sort of, that's the reasonable view. 50%, I think most researchers agree that individual differences are 50% genetic. I see no reason to change that for group differences. I think that would be the sort of default hypothesis.
Why did we wait to now to ask that question, Will? I could do another hour on his response, but we can't. So last words, quickly, Will.
Well, I mean, last words always to Shamika. I think that
Oh,
this
yeah,
is.
because I'm going to go around, and Shamika's going to be
okay.
last.
Fair enough. So I get the first last word. Okay.
The first and last word.
Yeah, I think that in terms of what Bo said, I think this is this is one of those academic debates that's actually important. I think that there are actually pretty easy responses. I mean, when you say, well, we've spent a ton of money trying to increase IQ, and I'll get into G in a second, but a short answer would be that we did. I mean, I read through Charles Murray's book, Facing Reality, recently. I was one of the reviewers for it. And he mentions almost in passing, I think it's page 23, that the black IQ, when we started testing in 1965 or whatever, is about 78. I think it's a fair estimate. Then he mentions that in the bell curve, when he famously estimated this, it was 85. Now it's 91 or 92, according to him. He says 91. And to be fair, as an honest broker, he also says the white IQ's gone up a couple points. It's like 102, I think. So it seems obvious that if you go from 78 to 92, we have seen him, and this is before dealing with what's called the Flynn adjustment, sometimes dealing with the fact that tests are a little harder. It seems like we obviously have seen some progress there. And if you look in situations where not just black kids, but poor kids are taken out of their original environment and placed in a better one, the most recent adoption study I looked at, again, at the end, there was a small gap between black and white adoptees. The white adoptees, I think, got up to 114 as the tested IQ score. Black kids were 108 or 106. But this gets into Tade's point. Like, if we're, after we actually provide resources for the poor, we're debating the difference between 110 and 114, I think everyone would be fine with that. So there's some questions about how replicable some of this stuff is, what exactly happened. But I do think we have seen quite a few of these jumps. The G question is itself an interesting one, but I mean, I think one response there would be, even if you argue that the move from 78 to 92 was due to black kids or poor kids learning how to answer simpler questions and take tests and so on, even that would mean that the original gap on the test that inspired a lot of the HBD movement, why do we have this 22-point gap, was just BS. Like, the best case scenario, there would be that the gap was always 7 points or 8 points or whatever it is. Now we have to see if we can close that. And 20% of that or whatever might be genetic. I just don't see giant gaps here. I think at the most significant, we'd see the differences we see in running. The question is how to train people to actually think the way we train most athletic men and women to run. It's a hell of a lot tougher question. That's really it for me.
And I'd want to say, like I said, it's bad. Bo had so much there, I would like to spend more time on it. But quickly, to add on to what Will said, I would say some of the examples you used were good. Like you talked about the Head Start piece, and I agree with that. But the interesting piece with the 4-month-old being in virtual educational isolation for a period of time, it kind of still goes back to the cultural thing, right? You said it didn't work, and I would agree with that. But it went through 5. Right? So then it happens to not only, obviously, in your testing, you need to factor in everything else, like what happens in those other hours. But at that age, it's not that much. But then, you're going to look at them when they're 15 and said, why haven't they made this many gains 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the road? You got to talk about what has happened from 5 to 7, 11, and 15, and what have they've been exposed to, which will bring you back to culture, which is, an interesting thing in itself. So, I don't know if we solved how much of that is genetic, but we
took a crack at it.
Yeah, we took a crack at it. I think that everybody had a really important, strong argument for why it is or why it isn't. And I think that, I guess the important thing is that regardless of how much of it is genetic and cultural, if all these people are moving to try to improve it, and we're seeing improvement, even if the improvement is just because you just taught them how, like Will said, to take a test, in a sense. That takes some level of intellect and critical thinking that's beyond the norm. So they're learning something. But none of this, whatever we ended up agreeing or disagreeing, is going to change the cultural debate we're having about what is fair and what's not fair, what's equity and what's equality, and the disparate impact of different groups, because everything is going to have a disparate impact. Even if we got everybody to the exact same IQ, you're still going to have different behavior, different, not just cultural differences. You're going to have people that just decide to do what they want to do, and there are repercussions to those performances. So I want to see, after soaking all this in for an hour, what Shamika thinks of all of this.
I've actually been sitting here wondering if I'm being punished for the 19th Amendment because I checked out about 42 minutes ago.
We let you all. This is the anniversary, the celebration of letting you all vote, and that's what you come up with.
Yeah, that's all I got. I was wondering when Tade was talking about sickle cell if he knew anything about anemia and if my O negative blood makes me a god. After that, I was done.
We need to do one of these with the real, black people are gods, hoteps at some point.
Oh my God!
Can I say something to just say one last thing?
right.
Bo's point, which it seems like his point is basically, we tried, we failed, so it must be innate, right? I mean, that's the point.
No, just to be clear, that's not my point. I think there's a whole network of data that I would forward to just say some subset of this is caused by genes. I think that's the most reasonable hypothesis, and that's just a small part of it, to be clear.
Yeah, but you are right. We have tried. I mean, the
Well,
fact that you're trying.
Well, we are
Save
going
some
to
shit
have.
for the rest of the men, fellas.
We are definitely.
I
going to
like
have
that
to pick
music.
this up
That's
at
good.
another time, but it's been great. I appreciate having both Tade and Bo here, and we learned a lot. Samika, thank you for staying awake through all of it, and
Yeah,
I hope you all
appreciate
enjoyed it. And thank you all for watching and listening, and catch you next week.